name is Matlock. I'm from Phillips. It's my pleasure to introduce these next two guys. They also work at Phillips Brewing Company with me. Over the last few years, we've invested heavily in sort of our lab, and these are the two brains behind that. These guys are currently, besides working at Phillips, we're involved in various projects. Currently, Thomson College, we're working with UVic, we're working with University of Washington and the University of Regina on a number of projects, and these guys fly sort of all around and present various very scientific things that I don't know what they mean. And so we're thrilled to have them here. It's Ewan Thomson and Ben Schottle. So yeah, enjoy what's in my mouth.
Hi there, thank you for coming. Today we are going to find out what is in your mouth. It's going to be presented as a story. Ewan is going to narrate the storyline. I'm going to add to the storyline throughout as we go. And we're going to look at the life cycle of a beer and all the opportunities throughout its life cycle to analyze it in a sensory manner, largely from a QC perspective. Here we are. This is Ewan Thomson, and myself, I'm Benjamin.
What's in my mouth? If you're thinking plant sperm, give yourself a high five. We all guzzle buckets and buckets of it every single day. And it's a good thing because that there's so much of it floating around out there because it gives us this, the seed. This is the beginning of our story, which is actually a story about a story because every single beer tells a story about nature and nurture, how it made its way from grain to glass through human hands, soil machines, vessels, and the whims of changing environments. The story starts with the genetic potential of barley, yeast, and hops and their cultivation and processing before they even reach you at the brewery. Next, the handling of these biological materials. Remember, they're biological. They're the thousands of human choices that influence the way they change over time during their storage and use. The randomness of individual yeast cells bumping up against each other as they hurtle through a fermentation, every single cell a unique character in this unfolding story. The final processing steps, small or big variations day to day in the fluid's movement to the package, and environmental conditions thereafter, all working to break the entropy of a highly pressurized, reducing microenvironment sealed off from a low-pressure, oxidizing atmosphere. And then, at the end of the line, the reason for everything up to this point is us, the observers. More on that later. But for now, let's back it up to those buckets of plant sperm. Chapter 1, the seed. The farmers have done their job. The barley has been impregnating itself all summer, while the sex-starved hop cones were finally put out of their misery and hung up to dry. Rainy season is back, and the rivers are running high again to carry away the shame of summer. A new crop of yeast is waiting patiently in the fridge after your last one crapped out on an ill-fated Imperial IPA attempt. Here, we'll get into raw ingredients, how to evaluate them, and what to look for in terms of seasonal or aging variation. Introducing Ben Schottle.
So let's start out with our raw ingredients. As far as raw ingredients go, barley malt is very important. And the ASPC is spreading information on a hop steep method, which is very, very insightful. It's as easy as making coffee. You grind up 50 grams of grain, you steep it in the thermos, filter, and enjoy. And my argument for doing this is to keep track of your pale malt. It changes all the time. Usually it's just imperceptibly, sometimes it's notably, sometimes it's shocking. Notably, we had some specialty malts that drifted out of specs. And had we been doing this at the time, we would have caught it a little earlier than we did. Hops, oh, you can just smell this. Oh my gosh, I want to do some hop angels in this. They need to pay attention from year to year. Crop varieties vary widely. Sometimes your Centis are more like Chinooks and vice versa. We've seen that time and time. And the age of your pellets, wildly important. I find that the first 6 months after our hops have been pelletized, I like them, but I don't tend to love them until about 8 months in. I find they hit a sweet spot, and that lasts for maybe another 8 months, and they turn, they change again. Your water, Well, in Victoria, our reservoir is surface water, and we have a lot of variability there. When the rains are high, the water hits more of the reservoir than it had before, touches more soil, we get more phosphates, we get algae blooms, we get microbial blooms, and I believe, not certain, don't quote me on this, but I believe the city adds more chlorine at this time to counteract that. So we can get some interesting duck pond kind of characters to our water. Every 4 years, they switch our water supply to a different reservoir. We noticed that when the color changed. We filled the CIP bin and it was green, so it made some calls. So if you get in touch with your local municipality, get out ahead of that. You can find out when they're going to do these things and their mains flushings, which can easily overwhelm your filters if you're not ready. CO2. We received some CO2 a little while back. It had a pretty funky smell. It was pretty fishy. We caught it early, and we were able to use it just for transferring tanks in the head space, and we used another source. We used our own reclaimed CO2 for CO2 sparging and carbonating.
Okay, if you notice that some cheesies and runts arrived on your table or in your lap, feel free to munch away on them. Okay, chapter 2, the seedling. The seed is sprouted and you're a new parent. Everywhere you look is potential, nothing is realized, yet somehow you have everything to lose. A moment's inattention during the sparge, a grimy finger inside an aseptic hose, or a yeast population running on empty. So many ways to go wrong. Here we'll discuss some detection strategies for the most common issues encountered during the green beer stage.
All right, so the greenest of green beer is your wort. You want to keep an eye on that. Heat exchangers are notorious for harboring infection. It's a large surface area. When you clean that thing, you're relying on temperature, concentration, and agitation. And because the surface area is so big and slow, you're removing agitation, and you're relying on the other two. So keep an eye on that. What we like to do is take wort samples regularly, and we'll incubate those for a couple days and revisit them. We'll smell and taste those. If something's up, that wort's not going to taste as sweet as it did the day you put it into the incubator. It's also a nice time to grab an in-house cone. I like to check in on the kettle finding efficacy at the same time. Dead simple test, put it on the desk overnight and have a look at it in the morning. DMS. If you have an open kettle and you have a rolling boil, case closed, your job's done. But if you have a stack condenser and it's fouled, you might be looking at some issues. If you have an external calandria, a degree for us on the outlet temperature made a world of difference. And you can't always trust your sensors. You know, the temperature probes tell you one thing, but you know, without doing the testing, the gravities before and after, you don't really know what's going on in there. So yeah, obviously DMS is like corn. We're familiar with that. Astringency. My goodness. You get a little greedy with those final runnings, you oversparge, and your final running gravity is down below 2 Plato. You're going to be looking at extracting some tannins out of those husks, and just no good comes of that. Fermentation. Get some yeast involved, and it's a whole new ballpark, whole new ball game. The acetaldehyde's natural, yeast is going to make it. You're going to want to minimize that by really dialing in your pitching and your aeration. A little too much, a little too little, it's going to cause you grief on the acetaldehyde front. It is produced during primary fermentation, but a couple times I've seen it late onset. You know, we have there's IPAs and double IPAs. If anybody else has experience with that, you know, get a hold of me. I'd love to chat with you. I'm not sure I have it figured out completely. But we've got these beers, tasted them in fermenter, lovely, absolutely lovely. Clarified them, got them into bright, and boom, clear as day, acetaldehyde. Could be explained that it's these carbonyl compounds are hidden by sulfur dioxide. Pardon me. Something else that the yeast will make could mask it for a bit and then uncover it later. I'm not sure, but if you have experience, let me know. More fermentation things. Diacetyl. Some of us are completely ignorant. I don't have the receptors. I can't perceive it. It has a distinctive mouthfeel for me, but I don't get the buttery, toffee, caramel kind of character that a lot of people need to suffer through. You can identify it a couple ways. Sensory, easy. Something people have been doing, I've been reading, is that you take your samples, spin the yeast down, decant that off, and then heat your sample. And what will happen is the excess alpha acetolactate that the yeast is making will then be chemically converted into diacetyl. It's just a straight up chemical reaction. So the yeast makes an abundance of it, floats around, tends to turn into diacetyl in the beer, then the yeast can metabolize the diacetyl. Hop enzymes. This is an interesting theory. I'm not sure this has been proven conclusively yet, but there was a poster board I saw. So hops are a plant which are very good at storing energy in their roots as starch. And so they're also very good at turning that starch into sugar when they want to use it. So what's proposed is that we craft brewers, we put tons and tons of hop material into the fermenters as dry hop. What we end up doing is adding a significant load of these enzymes. We're reducing these large sugars to something accessible to the yeast again. We're starting a small little kickstart to the yeast metabolism, just enough for them to make more of the precursor before they go dormant. You filter the beer and then in package this alpha acetolactate can turn into diacetyl. Happen like even once it's in package, bottles, cans, kegs. There are a number of ways you can reduce your diacetyl. Right, do those all first, but if you're at your wit's end, there are some enzymes that can help you out there. Hey, my favorite, esters. So one of the best things that fermentations do for me, make those glorious, glorious aromatic compounds. My favorite is that delicate candy floss ester. I believe it's an ester. If anybody can make that reliably, track me down. I want to get that to the right, so I love that. Esters are a curious thing. This is my segue to Dunder Pit rum. I don't know if anybody's familiar with that, Dunder Pits. So early distillers would have an abundance of spent wash. And the easiest thing to do to dispose of it, find a pit, throw it in the hole, right? So this stuff is a very high BOD, would just fester, fester, fester. It would become a dumping ground for all sorts of things, just local garbage and carcasses. They'd be foul. You'd smell these things before you'd see them, apparently. And I don't know why. It distresses me, but somebody got this idea. They took a little of this terrible festering Dunder Pit, and they put it in the fermentation for the rum. And what happened? This, of course, is not a real Dunder Pit. It's from Star Wars. Don't sue us. But it's a terrible, terrible place. Wonderful esters came out of this terrible business in the fermentation. And what happened? Well, it was reverse engineering. What would happen was esters are formed by yeast. What they do is they grab a organic acid, they combine it with an alcohol, and that's your ester. So what was happening in this Dunder Pit, organic acids were being produced, notably butyric acid, which is the most notable aroma in vomit. And they put it in the fermentation, I know. So the yeast is grabbing this and attaching it to ethanol and some higher fusel alcohols and making these incredibly fruity pineapple esters, much to my chagrin.
Good eye. Chapter 3, flowering. You've done all you can to protect your baby from disease and environmental chaos and given it all it needed to grow strong. It's now ready to flower and, soon enough, share its wonders with the world. But gremlins still lurk in every uncalibrated pressure gauge and leaky fitting, and oxygen is always waiting to feast on freshness. Here, we'll round the corner on the final stages before the beer arrives in your hand, taking a closer look at the sensory evaluation of conditioning, dry hopping, filtration, and packaging processes.
Conditioning, these are some basics, but if you have fermenters that aren't holding your pressure, you're not doing yourself any favors by continually topping up the pressure with CO2. As soon as that CO2 is out, oxygen is getting in, jack up the pressure with CO2, and you're going to drive the oxygen in that space right into your beer. You're going to have stale beer before it even makes it through the cellar. And of course, what does a stale beer taste like? Wet, soggy cardboard, that's right. Your chance to Nonio. Dry hopping, unsealed bags. Oh, hops will go cheesy on you so quickly. The easiest way to add a horrible cheesy flavor to a lovely beer that you spent time on. These Mylar bags, you can heat seal them. We have a foot stomp sealer that'll just press the bags and close them. You will trap oxygen inside, but it's less oxygen transfer than if you have a wide open bag. Filtration, yes, pumps suck theirs is. It's true. It's true. You want to keep an eye on those pump seals. Okay, I have some excerpts from a paper done by Malting this year, 2017 paper. This highlights how iron ions are just a bugger. They will expedite all sorts of terrible reactions. This shows how free radicals can be promoted by iron. So if you're defiltering, you're up over 4 bar, you're probably pulling a little bit of iron out of that diatomaceous earth, and you're going to be expediting scaling compounds and a handful of other dastardly chemicals. Also in that paper, they identified a wicked inflection point on the DO in beer. So if you're around 50, 60 parts per billion in your product, it's going to be okay. You get above that, and it's not going to be okay. And they kind of have this dead to rights here now. So your packaging line, yeah, watch out for the late stage blunders. Those conveyors are notorious for building up biomasses. Your fillers that are also at risk, especially things like underlid injectors in your canning line. It's a very anaerobic environment that bugs can set up in. And the biofilms, they're not necessarily the biggest trouble on the surface, but they're going to harbor anaerobic bacteria underneath them, which are going to love to screw up your beer. And here we have, it's not a beer conveyor, it's a sushi conveyor. If your conveyors are growing sushi, you're definitely going to run into trouble. And if you do some heat forcing, easy sensory stuff, know what's in your beer before it goes anywhere. 6 days incubated at 40 degrees is going to show you what beer's like 6 months down the road. It's not going to be great for some of the microbes that could give you grief, but it could promote some. This graph here shows free radicals plotted against sensory evaluation, showing that the 6-day mark at 40 degrees is a real thing. And that's in the title of the article right here.
So up until now, we have been looking at this from a very beer-centric standpoint. But in The Usual Suspects, where they let verbal Kint tell the story and kind of flip-flop back and forth between the office and the police station, and then the eventual demise of all these different characters, that's called a frame narrative. And you got to think of beer the same way. When it arrives in your hand, you don't know what it's been through. You can only use your senses to decode that story. Just like a dog, the sharper your senses are, the clearer the story gets. So don't ignore the role of context. We don't all have access to these, black crystal tasting glasses. For the most part, this is kind of how we make it work. That's fine. You can make all this kind of stuff work for you using your brains and using what's in front of you. So it's really important to be consistent with the way that you're tasting. Start off, before you even pick up your glass, smell your hands. What's on your hands? Are you smelling soap everywhere? If so, go rinse off again and start again. When you take your glass, fill it half full. Don't try and fill it right to the top. You're doing a tasting here, you're probably going to go through a dozen samples, so you don't really need a full glass anyway, but you're not going to be able to swirl it properly. So, be consistent about, pouring those half full glasses and being able to give it a good swirl if you need to. Take a big long draw through your nose and let it come back out again, so you get both the front nasal, retronasal, and just kind of think about that aromatic component as a separate one from the flavor itself and from the mouthfeel. So we usually kind of think of things in terms of, and evaluate things in terms of aroma, flavor, mouthfeel. When you actually take a sip, make sure it hits all parts of your mouth. Take 3 sips, because that's where you're going to get the building of astringency. You're going to notice more bitterness. If something is too tannic, you're really going to pick that up in those sequential tastings. Make sure you pick your team carefully and think about your goals of this operation. So do you want to, do you have a yeast strain that's notorious for producing too much diacetyl, for example? If so, find a team that's really good at picking up diacetyl. You won't miss it that way. If you're releasing something that's very much geared towards a general audience, then pick a team that represents that. Lots of people that kind of represent your whole consumer base. You don't just want the top super tasters in your brewery. And you can get all these fancy kits. You can buy the Siebel's kit. There's other ones out there too, with all these tasting standards. But don't forget that there's also all kinds of foods that contain these chemicals that you're looking for anyway. So you open a can of corn, you're smelling DMS, like huge amounts of it. That's a great free, almost free training tool for your brewery. Where there's diacetyl, obviously, and a brown apple core, you can smell the acetaldehyde seeping off of that. Notice your environment. When Ben or Nick and I, or the brewers, are walking around the different fermentation vessels trying to get a sense of what's going on in our fermentations, what we often notice is that if it's a root beer day and it's happening over on the other side of the brewery, those spices, all of the different stuff that goes into the root beer is volatilizing and covering the entire space. So the first sip you take, you're like, oh man, there's a lot of esters going on in here. This tank is screwed. And then you look around and all of a sudden you notice that there's somebody grinding cloves, 20 feet away. Same thing, if you have a still nearby, the distillation is going to go through a lot of different phases. So at one point it'll produce bananas, and then it'll produce some other ester, and so on. That's going to change the way that you're perceiving what you're drinking. So always be conscious that you're minding your environment. Try and find the most neutral smelling place you can to taste anything. So just reiterate that. It doesn't need to be a perfect, white little cubicle space, but go as clean as you can. So, what's in your mouth? Have you been eating spicy food? Bananas or avocados, those are oily, they're going to coat your mouth, and that can last for hours in some cases. Have you been drinking bitter or tannic beer, coffee, or tea? If you've done any of these things, or if you've got soap all over your hands, don't expect to decipher the whole story. Next up, what's your context? Are you using triangle tests? Do you just pull one beer at a time, taste it in isolation, and say, oh, it's great, and I trust everything about what I'm doing right now, even though I brushed my teeth an hour ago, had a coffee, and ran to work? There are so many things that can affect the way that you perceive, so don't take yourself out of the story. You're never going to be perfect, and every day is going to be different from the last. So use triangle tests wherever you can. If you have two beers you want to compare, ideally, take 2 that and blindly pour them, or have somebody pour them for you, so that you can have 2 of one batch and 1 of the other, and make sure that you can see the difference between them and evaluate those. And in an ideal situation, you have a batch that everybody has decided is the target for that brand, and compare everything against that. Triangle tests are great because you actually have statistical tools. In this case, what we're seeing on the right here is N, which is how many samples you need to get to a confidence level down here. So alpha would sort of be, if you see alpha 0.05, that means you're 95% confident. It's kind of more or less a standard with most statistics. So if you have 15 people, 12 of them have to give the same answer about a triangle test in order to say that it's 95% confident. And then what's your sample? Are you just grabbing one beer off of a line and 10,000 are going by in the next hour, like in this shot of a Budweiser factory? If so, you're ignoring 9,999 stories that all operate independently down the line. And you have to always recognize that from 1 hour to the next on a packaging line, things can change drastically. And finally, what's in your head? Are you loving everything you're tasting today? Are you hating everything you're tasting today? Your emotional state's going to impact things pretty severely. And sorry, I meant to mention earlier, we have some chocolates going around. They're not, are they around? Yeah. Okay, great, awesome. So if you have a little wafer of chocolate, yeah, nice. Johnny's good. Then we're gonna just do a little experiment to kind of illustrate how your environment can impact the way you taste something. So, hopefully you've got one still. We're gonna just play a couple of sound clips. So the first one's gonna come on in a sec. So go ahead and take a bite of that chocolate. Okay, now we're gonna do another. Anybody notice the difference? So we've done this back at the brewery a few times now. We usually use headphones. That's kind of the best we got right now. But take this back. You can try it on people that don't know what they're getting into, and you'll find what we're finding is usually kind of north of 70% of people will make some comment about how the lower frequency made it taste kind of sour or bitter, and the higher frequency made it taste sweeter. And so we don't know exactly what's going on there, but there's definitely some interplay between the way that your senses operate. So when you're in a brewery and you're listening to a clinking bottling line, or you're standing beside a pump and you're drinking a beer, these things are going to influence, just like the smells around you, how you taste the beer that you're trying to evaluate. So thanks so much for all your attention, everybody. We wanted to thank Matt Locke for inviting us here, all our lovely models at Phillips, and our collaborators all over the place right now with all our cool science projects. So if you want to contact us for anything, our emails are up here, and we'd be happy to take any questions.
I think we have time for some questions if anybody has any of them.
What's in my mouth?
I have no idea what's in your mouth. Yeah.
What's the single greatest piece of criteria you selecting your team of these panelists? Is there anything like, you mentioned like looking for those maybe on that heavy, yeast or that kind of thing, but like as far as a generic taste panel, what's the kind of the number one thing you look for?
Okay, so the question was, what's the number one thing you look for when making or selecting your tasting panel?
I think it's all about your calibration. So if you're really sensitive to diacetyl and she's really sensitive to acetaldehyde but can't taste diacetyl at all, you need to recognize that. So you need to kind of always put yourself on a sliding scale of and know what your whole team is made up of, so that when you taste something, you can pass it to the other person that's sensitive to diacetyl, and then ideally pass it to somebody who's got sort of a medium sensitivity and somebody that's not sensitive at all. And that way you can kind of give it an actual honest score about what it's going to do in the market.
I would just like to add to that, I really value somebody who can taste with a poker face. Any comment, even an eyebrow raise, can completely contaminate your panel. It's quiet, it's golden.
Especially if it's the boss that does the move. Any other questions? Yeah?
Do you find there's a certain time of day or anything that works best for tasting?
Okay, so the question was, is there a certain type of time of day that works better for tasting?
Yeah, I believe that morning is the way to go, and you want to give your tasters, you know, every opportunity to taste well. So if you start your day at 9, I'd plan the tasting for 11 o'clock. That's hopefully going to give people a couple hours, you know, since they had their last coffee or their last Danish, and God forbid they're chewing that minty gum at work. That is just my nemesis. Yeah, mornings before lunch, before anybody has spicy food for sure.
Anybody else? We're good? Okay, thanks a bunch.